All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining today. As you just heard, we are recording today's webinar. This is our fall webinar series on climate health and equity. And my name is Rebecca Ward. I will be co-hosting today's webinar series with Dr. Louie Rivers, who is a co-lead for the Carolinas Collaborative on Climate Health and Equity. Just some quick webinar logistics. I'm sure we're all really familiar with this by this point. But if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see a chat function. Throughout the webinar, please feel free to type any questions or commentary into that chat, and we'll get to it during a specific discussion section of today's webinar. So jumping into today, we are the Carolinas Collaborative on Climate Health and Equity, and we are hosting a multi-part series this fall to try to share a little bit about our organization. So C3HE is our acronym, and we are a National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Climate Adaptation Partnership. We're one of 13 regional centers nationwide working alongside communities to foster climate resilience. We're housed at NC State University, and we are a multi-institution team composed of physical and social scientists, community leaders, researchers, outreach professionals, and students. And our work centers on building community partnerships to advance climate resilience and health equity. And we work together with communities across the Carolinas to help predict and understand their exposure and vulnerability to consecutive and compounding climate hazards, such as flooding, heat, and drought. And importantly, our team's focus is on understanding our changing climate and addressing impacts in a just and equitable way. So we try to integrate social science, physical science, and regional knowledge to co-produce solutions that are tailored to meet unique local needs and priorities. We also focus our efforts on frontline and at-risk populations, and thereby strive to support communities that are disproportionately exposed to climate hazards and other compounding social inequities. There's a lot of information about C3HE, so I do want to direct your attention to the lower right of the screen where we have our URL, carolinascap.com. Please feel free to go there to explore more about our work and who we are. We are a relatively new NOAA Climate Adaptation Partnership. We began in the fall of 2021, and while we've hit the ground running with lots of collaborative, community-oriented work, there are a lot of audiences and potential partners who may not know about us and the ways that we could work together. And so to highlight the work that we're doing in the Carolinas, we decided to host this webinar series on climate health and equity this fall. And we're kicking off today with a panel discussion on environmental justice. So I'm going to turn things over now to Dr. Louie Rivers, who is co-lead for C3HE and co-hosting today's webinar, to introduce our topic and our panelists. Louie?
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca, for that introduction. And as Rebecca said in our introduction, we're a relatively new group. So for this panel, we wanted to talk to some people who have been doing this work for a while in the Carolinas and learn from them and share their experience with the audience. So this is something that our group can learn from, and we're hoping that people in the audience can learn from the work of people who've been doing this for a while. Because we have plenty that we need to learn to make sure that the work we're embarking to do is done correctly and justly. So we will be talking about environmental justice today. I think a lot of people in our audience are familiar with this idea of like communities of color are more likely to be exposed to environmental harms and to experience the better parts of the environment. I don't want to talk too much, but I just want to get started with a short quote from Dorceta Taylor, who I guess if we call Robert Bullock the godfather of environmental justice, she's the grandmother, but I think she's kind of the intellectual driving force for a lot of the environmental justice work. So I'll start with a brief quote from her, then we'll introduce our panelists. Environmental justice advocates want to see more than words to heal the wounds of the past. They want to see full accountability from environmental organizations about the concrete steps that they have taken and what they have accomplished in making their organizations diverse, equitable, and inclusive. The future of environmental justice is one in which people of color are recognized as equal partners in environmental affairs, and it is one in which people of color can realize the adage coined at the outset of the environmental justice movement: we speak for ourselves. So I take that quote seriously when I think about the work that I'm doing, whether it's part of our collaborative or the work that I have in my other hat as being part of the EPA. And I think all of our panelists can help speak directly to that work. I will start now with the introduction of each one of our panelists. And we'll start with Dr. Chris Hawn, and I'll allow them to introduce themselves, then we'll go to the other panelists.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for being here. My name is Chris Hawn. My pronouns are they, them, and theirs, and I'm the co-director for research and education at the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. Before that, I was a professor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, where I did work in environmental science and environmental justice, and particularly around community science, and started a project called Spidey Sensor, where communities monitor their air quality by collecting spider webs. And I do that work here at the network, along with other research with academic partners and community members. And so very happy to be here and talk about my experiences and share with these other lovely panelists.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Courtney Woods. I use she, her pronouns. I'm logging in from Durham, North Carolina, and I'm a faculty member in the Department of Environmental Sciences and Engineering at UNC Chapel Hill, where I've been on the faculty for a little over 10 years and also am an alum of that program. I always like to give a little bit of a personal background. So I am a product of the South. I've lived in the southeastern region of the U.S. for all of my life, I grew up in rural South Carolina, and have moved around from Tennessee to Georgia to North Carolina for school, and eventually landed in the Triangle area, which I think is one of the best parts of the country. I'm also I come from a long line of farmers and educators. Both of my grandparents were farmers, and a grandmother was a teacher, and almost all of my maternal line were in education. I feel like that fits well with the path I've chosen as an educator and also an avid food and flower gardener. And I also feel like it connects well with the professional path that I've chosen as an environmental health scientist. Professionally, I have been doing community engaged work for about a decade, a little over a decade. And the work that I've done hasn't centered on one particular source or one particular exposure, but I think the through line in my work is that I have worked to deeply understand the concerns of communities that are impacted by environmental hazards. A lot of that work has been done in collaboration with the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network, and have learned from great mentors from that organization. Currently, I'm doing work that's focused on understanding exposure to hazards in private well water, and also understanding some of the barriers and promoters to accessing public water in rural communities. And we also have another line of research that's looking at waste management, solid waste management, and understanding what some of the impacts of our solid waste management practices are on rural communities, with some focus on impacts on groundwater and private well water. With that, I'll pass it on to our next panelist.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Roslynn Powell. I am an assistant professor here at Western Carolina University in the Parks and Recreation Management Program, where I teach program planning and evaluation and diversity inclusion in Parks and Recreation Management. I just recently finished up my PhD at NC State, where I looked at the emotional labor of interpreting slavery at heritage sites. And so I was really concerned, after kind of hearing people who were doing amazing work with humanizing the enslaved and, changing the narrative and really pushing, public consciousness about this history, and hearing that they had no type of support in doing so, and just like the emotional toll that was taking. And so it really challenged me to think about emotional labor, not only in the kind of narrow range of like how, service workers interact with customers, but more so a broader understanding of the emotional weight from a lot of different sectors. And so, yeah, I'm really excited for the conversations that are going to happen today.
And Louie, if I can interrupt, we did have some polls if we wanted to do these now.
Yeah, I think so. It'd be great to see the responses to the polls. So if you're in the audience, it'd be great if you could respond to these polls if you haven't done so already. And I see in the chat that Max has made the polls open. So if you were to respond to the polls, this would be helpful. And I think we will try to build on your responses to some of our later, or to some of the panelists' later comments. In terms of the mechanics of the panel, I'll just start with the question, then I'll kind of let the panelists go into a conversation around it. And Rebecca has done a great job of providing the questions here on the slide. So we have kind of broad questions to get us started. So this first one, how do you perceive environmental justice? And maybe we'll get started with Dr. Hawn and we can move around to everyone else.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. Environmental justice, I really see it as a grassroots movement. The kind of action of environmental injustice, of burdening certain populations with toxins and really for economic gain, it has been a very old practice that's happened around the world. But the term and the practice of environmental justice has been something that has come from grassroots organizing right here in North Carolina, starting in Warren County, in which people were really using the tools of the civil rights movement to push back against that action of poisoning land and people for the practice of economic gain. So when I think of environmental justice, it's not just that that kind of distribution of waste or equitable distribution of contaminants, but really thinking about the movement of resistance to push back against that systemic oppression of exploiting land and people. So within that, I think that resistance movement also means that can shape, because that environmental injustice is so much tied to labor, to land, property, all those things, that environmental justice can be incredibly broad. So that, in the 60s, when Martin Luther King was supporting sanitation strikers, and that work, when they were working on better working conditions because of the hazards of transporting waste, that was environmental justice. We had those terms that was very much tied to the labor rights. In Durham, North Carolina, just now, we're having sanitation workers striking because of their working conditions and pay. And so these are very much things that, because of our practices for how we're processing products, what we do with waste, all of those things, all the labor, all of that kind of stuff ends up being really expansive in how we think about environmental justice. But all of it is, if people are not exploited, if land is not exploited, we can get rid of environmental injustice. So for me, it's very much in that it's rooted in that resistance movement, because it is about power for me.
If I can, if I can add to that, and I'll be short because I saw you unmute, Roslynn. I also want to offer that for me, environmental justice is about communities having some self-determination over what their community looks like, what's invited into their community, how it's developed, what sorts of employment they have access to. Yeah, I think a lot of that is, as Chris noted, is a result of decisions and power that folks make. And so that ultimately means that folks who are going to be most impacted by decisions need to be able to have some power in those decisions. I think it requires a deep investigation in terms of how we govern our communities and the ways that we make decisions about what comes into communities.
And I think just to kind of, in a way, parrot what Courtney and Chris have already said, when I think of environmental justice, I think of, it being a movement for resistance and, communities regaining a lot of their power in their agencies, in their agency. And I think it kind of falls under, really combating a lot of the systemic oppression that is built into our society. And so, to address environmental injustices require us to kind of grapple with ideals around capitalism and racism and sexism and all these other isms that kind of lead to this inequitable inequitable distribution of these pros and cons, these benefits, and bearing this unjust bearing of kind of contamination. I think it really falls under fighting a lot of the systems and pressures we talk about.
I know we have another question, but just a quick follow-up question for the panelists. How do you think that your conceptualization of environmental justice, and maybe for Dr. Powell and Dr. Wood, well, all three of you have encountered this system. How do you think that this works when it comes into a place like academia or the government?
I think one thing to note is that most environmental injustice that we fight is legal. So when we think about, if we think about the justice system in general, imagine if we found someone that was responsible for the deaths of thousands of people. We would do forensic evidence. We would hold that person accountable. We have a process of justice to, we can't bring back people, but we can, we have rules that say that is wrong. We have a whole process with that. So thinking about environmental injustice, a lot of the people responsible for environmental justice are doing so within the means of the law, and doing so with permission, oftentimes with support. And so to think about environmental justice means that it happens, or environmental injustice happens with the support of academia, with the support of the government, with the support of these larger systems that we're a part of. And that's everybody's a part of that. And so when thinking about how to navigate those things, something that literally everyone can do is to be able to reflect back within your own systems of how am I contributing to these things? How is this institution that I'm a part of contributing to these things? and I'm going to say how. It's not like if, it's absolutely how. And how can I use the power that I have, the power that my institution has to change something within that. And so it's, again, thinking about, we actually have to change some of these systems to take them out. So to remove that, because again, we can't, yeah, a lot of facilities are permanent. They're not going up in secret. They are absolutely allowed. And so it's beyond holding them accountable, but changing the rules, changing how we operate too. And also to be clear on like how like academia can be in charge of that. We have endowments that are investing in different things. So we're pouring money into fossil fuels. We also, our campuses produce a lot of waste that go into landfills in Black communities. Like there's all types of things a part of our processes that are interwoven within that, within those systems. The power that is generated, all of those things are a part of that.
This isn't a direct response to your question, Louie, but just to add to what Chris is talking about in this idea of systems, I think it's really important for us to recognize that we are a part of an ecosystem. And so the ways that we pollute the environment are going to have direct impact on us as humans who rely on the natural world and the environment for various resources and things that we need to live. And so I think, I mean, I know that Indigenous communities think about environmental justice in terms of making sure that we're caring for the natural world as well, and certainly traditional communities in other parts of the world. But I think when we think about environmental justice, we should also consider that it's not just justice for the humans who are impacted inequitably, but also think about how those decisions impact different species that are becoming extinct, and impacting other parts of the natural world that we rely on and that we are in commune with.
This was something I thought about a lot as I went through my PhD process, was the ways in which I was participating by being in the academy and wanting to stay in the academy, the ways in which, I was either being complicit or maybe even like an active participant. And so like, for me, it was thinking, one, educating myself about how the academy works, because I think there's a lot of things that happen kind of behind the scenes that a lot of people don't think about, of like how a university runs. And I think for me, the more I learned and became educated in how that worked, it really did challenge me to consider my power in this space and how I can enact change at whatever level I can. And I think that's one of the things I take with me as I teach, is because I want my students to think about, not just like the fun, enjoyable parts of parks and recreation, but in considering, looking at parks and recreation through an environmental justice lens and a social justice lens, because I don't think you can have one without the other.
Actually, I really like that, Roslynn, and just that point of, I know it can be really overwhelming to think about like everything is evil and everything is terrible, and I'm a part of all of it, and and that can be, it can just be overwhelming and paralyzing. But I like your point to consider your power, in that, because, we living in the United States, we living, or we working with institutions, all that kind of stuff, that does mean that we're causing harm just every day and passively. It's built in, but that also means that we have like more power than most people around the world to be able to actually make a difference. we can make an incredible impact by using that power. And it can be something pretty small that not a lot of people really care about. Like, hey, maybe somebody doesn't really care about which furniture company we use, but this one's with prison labor. And so maybe we can switch that. Like, those are actual things that can be done through mobilizing. Yeah.
Maybe we'll go to our next question. In the audience, I know you're probably thinking of a follow-up, so we will try to make sure we have time at the end for some follow-up questions. What is the emotional labor in the context of environmental justice work? And I'll get started with Dr. Powell for this one.
Ooh, I love thinking about emotional labor because it is so all-encompassing in what we do. And I think recently we have started having conversations about the prevalence of emotional labor because it's that invisible labor that takes a toll. And so when I think about the emotional labor of environmental justice, I think it is the feelings you have when you look around your community and you have those powerless feelings where, it doesn't feel like, change is happening at a quick enough pace or even at all. That all is emotional labor. It's in finding motivation to keep going. And then I also think about, as researchers, the emotional labor that we undertake in doing this work. And I'm sure we can talk later about kind of the extractive nature of research, but also just if you do any type of qualitative research in which you're interacting with a community, you are undergoing a ton of emotional labor, whether or not you think about it or you consider it. And I think that all takes a toll or influences how we go about this work. And so I think to do this work well and to do this work holistically, we really have to consider the emotional weight that we are carrying and considering, the longevity of the work, right? Because burnout is real. And emotional labor manifests in physical ways, right? So the stress that you undertake in doing this work and in telling your story multiple times, and showing up wherever you need to be to tell your story, that all is emotional labor tied into the physical labor.
Thanks for that response. Maybe we can broaden it out a little bit and maybe just give people a quick primer on emotional labor, because I know that was kind of a new idea was introduced to me.
Sure. So emotional labor kind of started about in sociology, and it kind of refers to the ways in which workers maintain their their inner feelings, but putting on the appropriate outward expression, right? So I think the easiest way to think about it is like service with a smile. Like you could be crying on the inside, but as long as you are smiling at that customer, that is what emotional labor kind of is. And we've kind of broadened it to think about the ways in which you present those outward emotions while also dealing with the inner ones. And so tempering your frustration so that, your message isn't getting lost, in your feelings. And in my work, looking at the emotional labor of interpreting slavery, it really, one of the things I thought was interesting is this idea of vulnerability and this expectation of vulnerability. And to be vulnerable and to be open requires you to kind of do a lot of inner work in presenting that outer work, because you need to give so much of yourself, but also maintain yourself so that you can keep going, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And just thinking back to our previous conversation, especially the second half of it, we were thinking about, are involved, how does environmental justice operate in like a system that essentially sanctions it? We can argue to some degree. And if our other panelists would be able to speak to this idea of emotional labor and just doing the work that they do in the various systems that they have to move through. And like if they've noticed that this is a part of the work that they've seen with colleagues, or I'm also thinking about what you said in the beginning of your response, Roslynn, in terms of like community members supposed to, really unpaid emotional labor.
Yeah, I think I can speak a bit to that for community members in terms of they oftentimes have to share their story so many times. And to share your traumas with strangers and to be asked to do that repeatedly, and oftentimes with no real purpose, right? It's like, well, come to my class and talk to my students and share your story. Because we want to have an authentic experience, right? We want to be able to know that this is happening. We want to be able to, do these things. It takes its toll. And so like literally sharing historic and ongoing trauma is really the ask there, and that absolutely takes its toll. It takes its toll hearing it, and takes its toll sharing it, and for people that have to do this work again to stop an existing like environmental harm that is established can take decades. If it goes through, that means sharing your story for years and years. And so just knowing what that cost is, oftentimes sharing intimate details that maybe I wouldn't feel comfortable unless I was just talking to a confidential therapist, but sharing to a room full of people, right? Of like something that is really hard to talk about, that is intimate, like the deaths of loved ones. Those are very serious topics, and they absolutely have a huge emotional toll. And people are willing to pay it because they want change, but not necessarily because they want, attention or other things like that. And so being recognized what that cost is, it is for a transaction. And so thinking about when we ask for that kind of emotional labor, that very serious emotional labor, that we follow up in kind, and or reduce that ask, and find other ways to be able to bring somebody's story to attention, or somebody's relevance to attention, without having them go into that. So just thinking about what we ask of community members, recognizing that cost. Again, people are used to paying it, but that doesn't mean that they should or does not take its toll. And then just being in I'd say like personally through my work, it is very emotionally taxing. And I would say that especially given that these are very long fights. So I don't know what the end is. I just know that we're in the present, and being able to make no promises on an action, but just a step is very challenging. I'll say that being in my role now is, I have, well, there's like that hard, there's that is really difficult. But in terms of what Roslynn was talking about, in terms of having to kind of monitor my inside emotions and my outside emotions based on who I'm interacting with, on a day-to-day basis, I'm interacting with more people that I can actually have I can share my like inner emotions. I can have my honest feelings. I can, if I don't feel like smiling, I'm not going to smile. And I'm in more spaces like that now. So.
As an academic, thanks for sharing that, Chris, and Roslynn. I'll say as an academic, there are certainly some things that come to mind in terms of emotional labor. One of the first is maybe one that I have felt, and I know others, including community leaders and organizations, have felt recently with this surge of interest in environmental justice. And that's this idea that any researcher, regardless of their relationship with community can or impacted populations can do EJ work. And this idea that any research related to understanding environmental exposure disparity is environmental justice work. And I think there's some hard feelings that lots of folks who are in deep relationship with communities and who are doing the work to deeply understand what justice means for them, and the ways that their research can be in service to that, and the ways that, even without research, other skills, resources, and other things that they may have access to can be in service to a community's search for justice. So I think there's a little bit of emotional labor in terms of bringing folks up to speed, and on maybe on the same page in terms of what a community might understand as environmental justice. And I think there's also a lot of emotional labor to work within institutions that really don't valorize community engaged work. It's clear through the structures that they establish, whether it's, an institutional review board, IRB, that does not have a clear process for community researchers to be involved, actively engaged in the research. If it's, a process by which community vendors or clients are expected to pay for things in advance and be reimbursed. There are a host of other examples of contradictions within institutions that say that they really are interested in having researchers collaborate with communities, and the structures that really inhibit that. So I think there's some emotional labor there in terms of changing those structures.
And again, for our audience, I imagine there's questions they want to ask, but we'll try to get to our next question, and we'll have time at the end for audience participation. How can researchers and community-based organizations find each other? And I'll turn to you, Dr. Woods, to start us with this question.
Yeah, so I would like to think that it is as easy as using, I don't even know the names of the dating apps these days, where you can, sort of have a pull down of your criteria, and then, the image of the researcher or a community partner pops up, and you can swipe left or swipe right. Certainly not that simple. But I think there are ways that, community organizations that feel like they could benefit from having research conducted can find researchers. Some of that, I would say one of the first things might be to ask trusted colleagues or colleagues or professionals that are, doing environmental justice work, students in their communities that may be at universities where there are researchers doing community engaged environmental justice work. I think that's one place to start. I think it's also important for community leaders and organizations to see who's present at community-based conferences, public hearings, community meetings. Those researchers, while they may not have the exact skill set that the community is looking for, they are likely in tune with some of the other nuances of conducting community-based research, and could direct the organization or a community leader to other folks who might be able to handle the work with care. And then I would also say, reading articles, news articles about an issue where they quote a researcher, those are also good places to get a start at finding and connecting with researchers. From the researcher side, I always say that it's important to, seek meetings or places where community voice is present. The EJ Network, for folks in North Carolina, the EJ Summit is a great place for folks who really want to understand what impacted communities are experiencing and what their concerns, needs, desires around research are. That's a great place to learn and to listen. Also for researchers, public hearings are also a good place to hear what some of the concerns are. Residents who might be on the receiving end of a proposed facility, or maybe coming up to offer comments about a new permit or permit renewal. I'll pause there. I think those are some good places for both sides to start. And Roslynn and Chris, you may have some suggestions as well.
And for Roslynn and Chris, and Courtney, if you can also, so we talked a little about how to find each other. Maybe from the researcher side, what are some things that you need to be prepared, or like how should you be prepared? And really from the community side also, what are some things that be prepared in these relationships for?
So I think where Courtney touched on this a bit, just like in terms of, maybe somebody doesn't have, or maybe you don't have the skills that somebody needs in that moment, or maybe you don't have the tools in that. I think one of the things that people going into a community academic partnership need to understand is that needs may not be a 100% fit. They're not going to be a 100% fit. And also there's a power imbalance between a community and an academic partner. And so for everybody involved needs to acknowledge that and make sure that there's not more harm done because of that. So what can happen many times is that because an academic system is not necessarily set up to do kind of the slow relationship building that's necessary to do community engaged work. As Courtney said, you have to have publications, you have to have metrics of success that are not in line with community engaged work necessarily. That means pushing back against the system of expectations that a researcher has to do in order to actually have a good relationship in some cases. It means being able to assess what each group, what their needs really are and what their expectations are before getting involved. I think it's also good to test things out. part of that power imbalance between academic partners and community members is that there's a huge difference in risk. And so community members are maybe at risk because their ongoing health is being compromised because of a polluting facility. They may be at risk in terms of intimidation from local law enforcement for speaking out against a corporation that has a lot of political power in that small rural community. Working with a researcher and trying to collect data or things like that may actually put them at more risk because they're collecting evidence against a harm. And so those are things that can put them at risk. And what are the risks that researchers are taking? And are those equitable, or how can the power of a researcher help shield some of the risks? Thinking about those types of things can also can help those relationships. I think community members, it's important for them to challenge the institutions that they work with. And so in some of those cases, that can mean like what Courtney was saying in terms of your system is built for just like, if we get money that it has to be reimbursed, it's just saying no to just operating in a kind of business as usual way with the academic institution is an important way to kind of challenge that practice. And a good partner, a good academic partner can help buffer that, make things easier. Thinking about how they can use their power, sometimes money, resources, to be able to support not just data collection, but what are the other needs that the community needs? So childcare for meetings, spaces, like things like that. Being able to think outside the box beyond data, because oftentimes data is the last thing that people actually need. And so if that's the one thing that you think that you can provide, I would rethink it. And I'll say this, I have a PhD. I've gone through, I'm absolutely a data nerd. Also, people with power don't need data to get things done. People with power don't need to prove that something bad is happening. Their word is enough. So just the need for data is already a power imbalance. Can that be skipped? Can we accumulate power without it? Are there other means of gaining power that don't mean data? And also, numbers at the end of the day aren't going to do anything. It's people responding to the numbers, it's people taking them to meetings, it's people doing those things. And so, can you increase people's numbers, people's presence? Like, are you willing to show up outside of just a specific tool that you have? And that could be a risk. Like, you may not be seen as a objective researcher at that point. Are you willing to risk those things? Can you risk those things? Again, are you a good partner if you're not? And so just thinking like holistically about what people need, and being able to respond to that, and being able to maybe use your skills to build capacity, and be able to like really reframe what you can provide too.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, Dr. Powell.
Oh, no, I was just going to add, at least from my experience, I think one of the things that I kind of try to keep in mind in going is that, like, in this context, I'm not necessarily the expert. Like, for my dissertation, I did oral histories because I was very much aware of, like, no one knows interpreters' emotional labor more than them. And so technically they're the expert. I'm more just a conduit for their words. And I think because they're like Chris said, there is a power dynamic. There are power dynamics at play. And so when it comes to, being stewards of people's stories, I think approaching it with that mindset does put different weight on like your role as a researcher.
Yeah, thank you all for the responses. We do not have enough time for this panel, but maybe we can move and try to take one question from the audience. I'll turn things over to Rebecca, who's now next to our other co-host, Callan. Yeah, go ahead, Rebecca.
Thank you for being understanding for my poor laptop. Yeah, so we've had a couple of questions come in, and they're also great. So I'll just go to the first one that I see here, which is everyone's advice to graduate students or others who are constrained to shorter project or grant timelines. How can they frame their work within the longer timeline of environmental justice?
Yeah, so I would say that as a student or as someone with short-term or short-term things, that can still be valuable, but also think about collective power as well. And so if we think about just a 2-year master's, what can be done? You can't like build relationships, do all these things, but you can deepen an existing relationship. You can provide part of some information or some piece about a bigger puzzle. So I would actually really encourage people within academia to partner with each other as they build out some capacity. So have long-term relationships collectively. That can also make a better support for communities, because people leave, and that's fine. Academic institutions or people within them are ephemeral. Projects are small, but being able to have a collective long-term support and each individual contributing to the strength of that relationship can be really powerful. So just in terms of collective action and movements that we talk about for communities, students, researchers can think about the same things.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I would like to give our panelists time to like have a parting word, and then we kind of like a call to action at the end of the panel. I want to make sure there's time for that. I've greatly enjoyed this panel. I think in the chat we've seen that also. Also, I'm gonna like be quoting you, Chris, on the powerful people don't need data. That was a jewel. So I appreciate that, but I want to give time for our panelists to have a final word, then a call to action. Thank y'all.
I can go ahead. I think this work requires manpower. And in order we have that manpower, I encourage everyone to practice self-care, and not just, bubble baths and massages, but more so the radical kind of self-care that Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks talks about, of, recognizing that pain and caring for oneself when these systems are not set up to care for us. So yeah. And thank you so much for having me.
I'm gonna attempt to make a closing remark and make an attempt to respond to some of the questions here too that are in the chat. So I think one is to go back to Roslyn's charge to all of us to try to make change where we are and to do what we can where we are. And so, for folks in academic settings or institutions where you realize that the structures aren't set up well for for community engaged work, or for folks who are doing more advocacy based work. I think collecting, building collectives and making visible those those barriers is important. So that can sort of respond to the question about the IRB. At the point that you realize that there are challenges, I think it's important that you raise those issues to the folks who are making decisions about those structures. And I also think it's important for us to think a lot about how our power and resources are distributed. In terms of funding for EJ work, we often, or for any sort of community engaged work, I think we should ask community what they need, and consider setting a baseline to say, I'm gonna, with any funding that I receive, I'm gonna put at least X proportion to for the community partner. I would encourage 30% or more if you can. I know that there's, F&A for our institutions that's really high, and but if you can allocate 30% or more, I would aim to do that. Yeah, and lastly, I would urge researchers to consider this idea of being an objective researcher as a, as something that is a bit false perception. We are always placing our own values into our work and into the ways that we teach and into what we decide to teach or not. And so I think if we consider advocating for people's health and rights as something that aligns with our values, we should aim to do our research and collaborate with communities in a way that that fulfills those values, personal values, and ethical values.
One of the beauties about being in education is that we're often lifelong learners. And I'll say I encourage people to go ahead and do that, like learn, but you don't necessarily have to learn just within academia to learn about, community engaged work or some of the best things with it. Some of the things that you can learn are actually from activists themselves, and those lessons are often taught for free because we need support. And so being able to do things outside of academia and learn things outside of that space, I think is also important, especially when we're asking community members to learn things within an institution to reciprocate that. And so, learn from grassroots organizers. You don't have to be an organizer yourself, but you can learn some of those principles. Again, those are all it takes to, join some of these movements is just to be a human, and you have that. And so just to don't be afraid to step outside that box and wear a different hat, you're a community member too. And you absolutely have power just within that, and to be able to learn, that can also help us be able to connect, learn some of those principles in which all of us run. And so that's also how I learned as a graduate student, from social justice movements going on in Durham. And so being in North Carolina, I'm not sure where everyone's joining from, but what a beautiful, rich history and legacy of grassroots organizing we have here, that is continued through students, through communities throughout the state. And so to be able to witness and not just see, but like take part in is something that we have access to here. I did, if I can share my screen real quick, I wanted to put one call very much along those lines, is that we are hosting a rally in West Baden, North Carolina, where people have been fighting toxic waste from an aluminum smelting facility. So extremely hazardous materials that have been buried in a Black community and buried with dirt and also with silence from the responsible polluting industry, that they're saying everything is safe because they are responsible for reporting back and measuring samples, and they know exactly where to measure and get a good sample from. But while people continue to die from cancer and other things from the hazardous exposure, through the storage of waste and also working with it in previous times. So we're having a rally this Saturday in West Baden. We're having a toxic tour so people can learn about the exposures and things that people are experiencing, sign making, lunch with the organizers, and also a rally to protest and demand for cleanup. So it's a great place to be able to learn about how environmental justice is experienced through communities and what people are doing about it.
Thank you to our panelists for joining us today and sharing their thoughts and, insights about this topic. Thank you, Dr. Hawn. We'll leave this up as we close out. We're a little bit past our hour, but please feel free to reach out to us. I want to turn things over briefly to Rebecca to see if you have anything that you want to close us out with.
Yes, thank you to our panelists and to you, Louie, for a really fantastic webinar today. We just wanted to say that this is part of a series. So coming up in October, we will have another webinar.
October 26th.
October 26th. Here's our slide real quick. If you were on our email list for this webinar, you will get an email about that one. So we hope to see you there. And then please, if you enjoyed today, please go to carolinascap.com where you can learn more about us. You can look for the recording there once it's up, and share it with any other colleagues you might have who may be interested. And with that, we will close out for today. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.